Welcome to the Happiness Rules podcast. I'm here with Jay Coen Gilbert. And Jay, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and kind of your background.
Sure. Thanks, man. Well, my name is Jay Coen Gilbert. I'm a husband and a father, a son and a friend. I've been married for 30 years. Last October, I've got two adulting post-college kids entering, early stage in the workforce. And I'm the son of two entrepreneurial parents, one who was an architect, my dad, and the other who was an executive search, my mom. And I'm 58 years old. Grew up in New York City, living outside Philadelphia, and have been a serial entrepreneur. Built and sold a basketball footwear and apparel company called AND1. Then helped co-found and build a community of businesses around the world called B Corporations. The organization that we founded was called B Lab, which is the nonprofit behind that global movement to redefine success in business. And then over the last 5 years, I felt called to work with white men in the US who give a damn about the future of our country and are wanting to do something about it. And that means finding a way for white men to show up as partners in creating a country that works for everybody, regardless of their race or their gender or their zip code or what income bracket they were born into. And so that's a little bit quickly about me as a person and through my vocation over the last 30 years.
And I love that you start off by saying you're your husband, a father, a son, a friend. So the work is not where you start.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's probably more recent for me. Like most folks in the U.S., but particularly most men, maybe in particularly white men, we tend to live in an achievement-oriented culture that judges us, or at least we feel judged by what we do and what we produce. And I have found with each successive entrepreneurial venture, from AND1 to B Lab to now White Men for Racial Justice, it's been more and more important to both be and then to appreciate others for who they are as human beings and not just for what they can do or produce. And so while of course it's important stuff, like I want to feel useful in the world, I want to feel like I'm contributing something, but actually meeting people as full human beings, I've come to understand as, if not more important than just understanding what people's skills and capacities are.
So tell me about that transformation, right? From running a global brand with And1 and moving into B Corporation. And then this identity shift where it's not about achievement. How did that evolve?
Yeah, mostly through my own failures, honestly, and through other sort of like traumatic moments in my life, like whether it was the movement from AND1 to B Lab and to the B Corp movement was mostly catalyzed by a series of things that happened in September of 2000, I suppose. No, I think it's just 2000, right? Which is not 9/11 was 2000, I believe. Is that right? Or 2001? I
It
can't
was
remember.
2001. Uh,
2001.
Stab. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're totally right. So 2001, so 25 years ago. And during that month, 9/11 happened. My sister was safe and alive now, but pulled off of Easy Street by first responders. She was covering that for broadcast as a broadcast journalist. Our dad died a few days later, unrelated, but at that same time. And then a couple of weeks after that, a beloved colleague at AND1 was killed in a sort of a freak car accident. And so I had a pretty rough September. And
Mm.
out of that led to a lot of introspection as to whether what I was doing was the highest and best calling. If I had limited time, what would it be? And so I don't think I'm alone in the world of people who've been motivated to like re-examine whether what they're doing feels like the highest and best use of their time and talents after a death or near-death experience of theirs or somebody that they love. But that was certainly what happened for me. And that led me on a path to, while certainly proud of all the stuff we had done at AND1, both as a pure financial business, but also like how we showed up in the world for the people that work there and our supply chain and the community organizations that we partnered with. I was hungry for more of that, for that to be more central to the work. And that led to a multi-year exploration that sort of culminated in this idea of a B corporation. which is a company that's actually purpose driven, not profit driven. And that purpose is both measured in how they create value for their workers, community, and the environment, but also their legal DNA is shifted so that they're legally accountable to create value not only for their shareholders but for all of society. And so that was a first shift from building a business to building a community of purpose-driven businesses. And it was mostly catalyzed by the pain that I experienced that September and a hunger for more meaning and purpose in my life than just making the next season's worth of t-shirts, shorts, and shoes.
So what does B Lab actually look like? What is the nuts and bolts of that?
So B Lab is a global nonprofit organization that has maybe 500-600 people in 25, 30 different countries around the world, that oversees both a standards body that evaluates companies on their overall social and environmental performance, how they treat their workers, how they steward environmental resources, how they engage with their communities, et cetera. Also, companies that legally change their corporate accountability. So they're no longer accountable to maximize profits for shareholders, but they're accountable to maximize the well-being of all their stakeholders. And so there's now over 10,000 certified B corporations in over 100 countries around the world, ranging from multi-billion dollar publicly traded companies to venture-backed tech startups, to every flavor and size and shape company in between. And B Lab both develops and administers the standards and the verification process, has developed a legal framework, and has worked with policymakers in the US and around the world to create the laws that make that legal structure possible as a recognized corporate structure, and then works with the B Corp community to exercise their collective voice, whether it's to create policy change or the underlying culture shift that's necessary to advocate for that culture change. B Lab is the nonprofit that helps support all those companies and helps mobilize them towards collective action to create an economy that works for everybody.
So how did you grow that? Like what was the inception for, because it's sounds like it's really grown.
Yeah.
You have standards and people signing legal contracts and stuff. Tell me about the inception of that.
So the inception of it was three college buddies, you know, uh, uh, sitting in the proverbial garage, bringing together IKEA tables and plugging in, you know, phones into the jacks in a guest bedroom. It starts with that, and it starts with a lot of listening. Manuel, like whatever ideas we had coming in, that we'd all been in the private sector, for the first act of our careers in private equity or as operators or as entrepreneurs. And so we had some business experience, enough to know that business as usual was not leading us down a good path as individual human beings or as a society, that we could do better. And whatever ideas we came in with were not nearly as good as the ideas that we heard from hundreds of other entrepreneurs and investors and academics and thought leaders who had been studying this for much longer than we had. And so what we were able to bring to bear was some credibility as entrepreneurs and investors, as private sector folks who'd had some success, who could come in and talk to other entrepreneurs as peers, not as pleading academics or NGO begging people to do something different. But we knew what it meant to withstand the pressure of making payroll or margins getting squeezed, in a ever concentrating marketplace, or whatever it might have been. And we were talking with entrepreneurs who felt a similar desire to lead with purpose. And they recognized that they would have a tough time doing so if they were all on their own. And that having a brand, a unifying brand that could speak to consumers or investors, current or future employees, policymakers, it would say, that's a business I can trust. That's a business that's worth buying from, investing in, that I'd want to work for, because it cares about more than just making money. It cares about making a difference. And it recognizes that for-profit businesses aren't inherently evil, but an economic system that forces people to park their humanity at the door and then show up as something else, like Homo economicus or something, when they walk through the door, and only make quote unquote rational profit maximizing decisions is itself dehumanizing and is in some ways a business case jail that we all wanted to break out of. And so that exploration over several years led us to create the standards that would then be used to distinguish B corporations from traditional corporations through the performance, their transparency, and their accountability to create value for society, not just for their shareholders. And so the process was three guys getting together, sharing a love for each other and a higher purpose, and then working our butts off. And so, like any other entrepreneur, we worked our butts off for years, and we're talking to lots of folks and invested them in the outcome. And the first 10 companies that said they wanted to be B Corps turned into the next 30, turned into the next 100, turned into the next 300. And ultimately, this was about building a community of businesses that wanted to be doing something together that none of them could do alone. And so a lot of the learning, Manuel, at the beginning was not putting ourselves at the center of the conversation, but putting the entrepreneurs at the center of the conversation. And said, we're building a platform to enhance your leadership. And that's why we exist, is to help you shine individually and to help you do things together. That would be impossible for any one company to do alone, no matter how big you got, because the economy is a lot bigger than any individual company. And so we can't create the change we seek in the world without doing it together with others.
Is the purpose for these businesses, is it the same purpose, or everybody kind of etches out their own unique place in the world, what their purpose is?
Yeah, great question. The answer is yes, meaning they all share a common purpose to redefine success in business as more than profit, right? They all share that in common, and they've all amended their corporate governing documents to hold themselves accountable to that higher purpose. And how they do that varies wildly between each company. Some companies might be primarily motivated around climate issues. Some might be motivated around soil health. Some might be motivated around nutritional health. Some might be motivated around economic development in otherwise marginalized communities. So those will all vary, but what they all share is a belief that we need to put people over profit. And then to have an economy that works for people not only means people that are around today, but also means our kids and our grandkids, which means we have to be concerned with the quality of the air and the water and the things in our natural systems that enable a healthy business environment to exist.
So the purpose is people over profits, and then mission is in there too. Whatever their unique missions are, areas of interest.
That's right. And they all have to meet, they all have to they all have to be legally accountable to that higher purpose. How they achieve that purpose will be different, right? But they all have to measure their performance, whether it's environmental or social. They all have to measure their performance and be publicly transparent about their performance, regardless of what their personal preference is. And they're accountable to an independent third party set of standards in doing so, which is what gives them credibility in a marketplace that's seeking information to distinguish good companies from just good marketing.
Yeah, yeah. So do you have your own kind of unique purpose? How you kind of think of your purpose in the world, the impact that you want to make?
Yeah, I think so. It has evolved and it will continue to evolve, I'm sure. Where I'm sitting right now, Manuel, is that I think we have a very unhealthy culture of hyper individualism, that the currency of the realm is how much power we can accrue, and whether we accrue and maintain that power through a gender hierarchy, a patriarchy, or whether we accrue or hold that power through a class hierarchy, and where wealthy people matter more than others, or we maintain that power in a racial hierarchy where white people are deserving of more deference, respect, credibility, presumed competence, or privilege as a result of their whiteness. I think all three of those things, race, class, and gender, all play out around, are all focused on uh, uh, maintaining power. And I think we need so for me, my purpose is how do we create a culture that recognizes that that's a sickness of separation that can only be healed through connection? And the people that are often feeling most disconnected and most alone in our culture are often white men, and those folks are often suffering. And so when we look at statistics about white men having declining life expectancies in the United States, that's primarily due to the massive increase in substance abuse and suicide. And those are forms of sort of self-medication for pain that folks are in. And folks are in pain for many reasons, one of which is there's an economic system that's sort of working against their own health and making it difficult, more and more difficult, to play the socialized role of provider that most men grow up, thinking that that's their role to play. And that all of us are told that, like, we're going to be valued by what we achieve and what we produce. And particularly for men, that's the case, not who we are or what we care about or who we care about. And so for me, even though there are plenty of white guys who are suffering and who are struggling and who don't have economic resources and have experienced and are experiencing hardship, they're not experiencing that hardship because of their race, you know? And engaging those men in a real conversation about race and class and gender and culture, and how they can be part of building connections and a culture that honors those guys for who they are, and the inherent dignity of being a human being, including a white dude, and not feel like you're being, shamed and blamed for everything that's happening, is a big deal. Because if we can get a critical mass of those men who are typically disproportionately represented to their percentage of the population in positions of power and assets and wealth, if we can get a critical mass of those men to recognize that there's a future that needs them to be their full selves, doesn't need them to shrink, doesn't need to be overly deferential, but needs them to show up as partners, not as controllers, not as leaders, but as partners, we can live in a much different world. And that's a world that I'm interested in living in. I'm interested in my kids and grandkids living in. And so for me, my purpose is to help dismantle those cultures and systems of power over and transform them into systems where we seek to be more powerful with others instead of over others.
No, so that's beautiful, um, and inspiring. The hyper individualism and the loss of connection, um, in people who are disenfranchised across ages and gender, um, is staggering.
Yeah. And what's been most surprising to me, man, about is, like, I've made zillions of mistakes, and many of those mistakes have been compounded because I valued the outcome over the relationship. And as I've come to understand that the tools that had made me successful as an entrepreneur often made me unsuccessful as a human being, and that many men were experiencing the same thing, that they were really hungry for connection, and they were realizing that their way of showing up in the world, including in the workplace, maybe even especially in the workplace, was actually no longer serving them very well. In an increasingly diverse world, in order to compete successfully, we're going to need to use all the available talent. And if not all that available talent is able to be on the team, or doesn't feel welcome on the team, or you haven't created a culture on the team that values all those different perspectives, you're not going to be as successful, as innovative, as competitive as you would be. And that's all true. And it's also, you're not going to be as happy. You're not going to have as many fun and rewarding relationships in your life. And what a lot of guys are hungry for, maybe even especially guys that hold sort of positional authority and power, is, the expression, "it's lonely at the top." That's a cliche for a reason. And a lot of guys that I've been in business with and worked with, the higher they get, often the worse they feel. One, because they feeling more and more disconnected from folks, and two, because they're being asked to perform on a very narrow set of metrics that are often purely financial, and by definition crowd out all these other aspects of human relationship and things that they care about. So they're being asked to strip away so much of their humanity in order to be quote unquote successful, even if it feels like it's against the values that they hold. And that's living in that cognitive dissonance is painful. And so a lot of folks are looking for a way out of that. And that often requires not just a different way of relating to each other, but then being in a system with different sets of incentives. And so the linkage between the white men for racial justice work and the B Corp work is the B Corp work a lot of that was about changing structures and systems and incentives. So changing the fiduciary duty of corporations, creating measurement tools to manage performance by a different yardstick than just quarterly earnings. That's all very much about systems and structures, fairly clinical, sort of like above the neck, kind of thinking and acting. And white men for racial justice has been like, that's great and necessary. And the culture that we live in of the hyper individualism and achievement orientation, sort of the never enoughness of proving ourselves, is the cultural soil in which those systems manifest. And so if we change the systems but don't change the culture will then just regrow those weeds. It'll regrow, some other system that is growing out of that same culture of hyper individualism and disconnection. And so we need to go further upstream or into the soil to address sort of culture and worldview and how we relate to each other in order to change how we behave towards each other.
And for some reason, video just stopped. Okay. So the people at the top, and whether they're the leader or, beneath, do you think they're recognizing and searching for meaning and connection, or they've just gotten so acclimated that they don't even have any idea that there's something different available to them and how they're relating to people and what's available to them?
I think both are true. They certainly were true for me. And of the, hundreds and hundreds of CEOs that I've spent time with over the last decade or two, I think both are true. I think CEOs are actually just people, and people seek meaning in their life. They want their short, brief time on earth to be of use. And whether not just to their family, but they hopefully want to make a contribution to the world broader than that. I think that's true for most folks. And business is a perfectly wonderful way to do that. Organizations are perfectly wonderful ways to do that. They bring people together towards a common purpose to do things that they couldn't do alone. That's an amazing thing. But the structures that we've set up in the private sector, in business, are set up to limit our choice. The way the economic system is set up legally, structurally, is you're allowed to do anything you want as long as your purpose is to maximize profits for shareholders. And as soon as you impose that constraint, that design constraint, you drive all kinds of behavior that itself can create separation, disconnection, and dehumanization, right? Because you then treat people as expenses, and your job is to minimize your expenses, and your job is to maximize your returns. And the way you maximize your returns is to minimize the number of beneficiaries of those returns. And so by definition, I'm trying to concentrate ownership and eliminate labor costs. That's literally how the game has been set up to play. And so I can get lots of accolades for playing that game well. And I can get on the cover of a magazine, and I can be invited to give a TED Talk, and I can be invited onto a podcast to tell the world how I built this. And it's all an appropriate recognition of achievement of building an enterprise, but it's at best a half truth, or at best a partial picture of what you've built, because the question is, at what cost and for whose benefit? And if the answer is at any cost for my benefit, then the very happiness we seek has been undermined, because we are biologically social creatures. And so if the act of accruing wealth and power disconnects me from other human beings, and I have to live behind a wall, literal or figurative, because I don't know whether people like me just for my money or just because of the contracts I can give them, or I have to live with this security because I have to protect the stuff I've got because now I have something to lose. Like, all of those things disconnect us from relationships. And the thing we think we're buying, that comfort or happiness that we think we're buying, actually at some point is inversely related to the wealth we have. To a certain point, like the money is useful and good. We can be comfortable and not have want, and we can have healthcare. We can all those kinds of things are quite useful. Take vacations, none of those things are bad. Pay for our kids' education, have our retirement. Like by all means, like we should all be able to do that. And there'll be differentiations in how much people have. Like that's not by itself a bad thing. But when it gets so grossly distorted, we become disconnected from other folks. And ultimately, I'm unaware of anybody who has been on their deathbed wondering how much more money they could have made. They're mostly wondering they want to be surrounded by people who love them, and you're going to be loved for who you are, uh, and what it felt like to be around you and what you contributed to the world, not for how many toys you had or how many zeros were in your bank account.
One of the founders of the positive psychology movement, when he was asked, like, what are the findings of positive psychology? Can you summarize that for us? And he said, other people matter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super simple. Like most, you know, like most truths, the simpler they are, the harder they are to live into. And so the golden rule, like the B Corp movement is nothing more than the golden rule applied to the marketplace.
Great, great, great. Um, Jay, is there anything left unsaid that you'd like to cover?
The the thing that I think would be useful to share is the single best advice I ever got in this work was to maybe try to be a little less certain and a little bit more curious. And I honestly had no idea what that meant the first time this woman shared that with me. And I could, I suppressed an eye roll and tried to keep a poker face to make it like I understood what she was talking about. And it took a while, but now I view that as like the little mantra in my pocket that I keep that helps keep me on track. And so when I think about the purpose of this podcast and what beyond success and how do you what is the pressure that faces high achieving leaders, or what pivots are necessary, or how do we think about ourselves in this? I think about we could all use a little bit more curiosity and a little bit less certainty. And we could all benefit by recognizing that none of us are really good enough to do this alone. And the good news is we don't have to, we can be much more effective and much more powerful and have much more meaningful and joyful lives if we do it together with others. And so that for me has been, whether it was at AND1 or the B Corp movement or now with White Men for Racial Justice, each of those things have been more successful the more I leaned into partnership and connection. And the more I could let go of my own certainty that what I thought was true was true, let alone the only truth.
So stay curious just a little bit longer, and it's okay to be uncertain. Stay in that uncertainty. Jay, where can people find you, learn more about what you're doing, and
Sure. I'm currently spending my time with this national community called White Men for Racial Justice. And you can find that at umrj.org. And you can reach out to me directly at Jay, at WMRG.
no? So I really appreciate your time, and thanks so much for an inspiring message for the world. People over profits.
Thanks, Manuel.
Yeah,
Appreciate you.
thank you.